at what promises to be a very interesting and relevant two sessions today. Our first session today is going to look at CBAM, and our second session is on the emissions trading scheme. We're joined by three witnesses today. I'm going to start by asking them to do a short introduction from each of them, if they would be so good, and can I remind both commissioners and witnesses to make their responses to each other pithy and short, please. Thank you very much. That would be appreciated. Could we start with introductions? Chimdi. Chimdi, as we like to say, you're on mute.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me today. So I'm Chimdi Obienu. I am a research consultant at EcoAct, which is a climate consultancy. Here I focus on carbon markets, so emissions trading schemes, carbon taxes, border carbon adjustments, and I help companies to assess and quantify their financial risks associated with these mechanisms. I have an academic background in energy and environmental policy, and prior to EcoAct, I was working at a policy consultancy in Washington, DC.
Thank you. Laura.
Good morning, everyone. Very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I lead the Shipping Sustainable Markets Research Group at the International Institute for Environmental Development. We focus predominantly on countries in the global south, looking at the drivers and levers of sustainable markets. We have a big climate program, working particularly with the least developed countries around both their adaptation towards climate change, but also in terms of how they influence debates around mitigation. So very pleased to be here today.
Thank you very much. And Luca, please.
Hi everyone. Good morning. Luca Taschini. I'm a professor and chair of climate change finance in the University of Edinburgh Business School. And predominantly my research is about design and implementation of carbon pricing instruments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Welcome to all three. Could we start with an overview question, please? In relatively simple terms, what is the EU CBAM and what is the outlook for implementation? Could we start with Laura, please?
So probably my colleagues, and I was going to try to email in advance, they're probably working more on this than I am. We're looking more at the implications of it. So my responses are going to probably come in more along the latter question. So given we don't have a huge amount of time, perhaps. Luca,
no, that's fabulous. Thank you very much.
Would like to pick this one up.
No, sure. Luca?
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to be brief here. I think that most of these border carbon adjustments are used to tackle different type of targets. And it seems that the ultimate aim here for the European carbon border adjustment is to try to maintain or control carbon leakage. So basically, what the EU CBAM is trying to ensure is that foreign producer pay a price per ton of CO2 emissions that is equivalent to what a similar position EU producer would pay. Very quickly on the outlook, there are two phases. There's a monitoring phase that starts from 2013, in fact started, and will end in 2025. During this period, importers are required to measure and report the embedded carbon emission in their imported products. However, no charges are applied in this initial phase. After that, from 2026, there will be a charging phase. So starting from that date, importers will be obligated to pay for the carbon emission associated with imported products. Outlook, I think that the successful execution of the monitoring phase very much depends on the development of measurement and reporting mechanism alongside some resolution of technical and administrative hurdles. I don't think this is insurmountable. Regarding the next phase, well, that very much depends on many different factors that I think we're going to discuss later during all the other questions.
Thanks very much. That's a good starting point. Chimdi, anything to add to both the subject itself and the outlook for implementation, please?
Yeah, might just add just about the kind of sectors that are covered. So it's kind of imports for the EU of iron and steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. So those are the kind of imports that are covered. And then just a bit more color on kind of on the implementation so far. So it's just started really companies have had reporting obligations, as Lucas said, from the start of this month. And the EU has published some support materials, data collection templates to start helping companies with the process. Until July of next year, the EU will allow companies to use kind of simplified methodologies to calculate embedded emissions. But after July of next year, the kind of more complex kind of full implementation of the kind of reporting methodologies will take place, and companies will be expected to kind of be up to speed with all of the EU's expectations. So just that.
Sorry, Chimdi, just to pick that one up, when you say companies, do you mean all businesses, or is there size relevance, or how does that work?
So when I say companies, I mean any companies that have the reporting obligations under CBAM. And so that's not necessarily about the size of the business itself, it's about the goods that they're importing and the carbon intensity of those goods. So that's what I mean when I say companies will have these obligations. Anyone who is reporting.
Brilliant, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. Moving on from there, Tamara, it's good to see you. I hope your morning is going well. Can I give the next question to you, please?
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone. So my first question is, can you all hear me, by the way? I just want to check because I'm going in and out of AirPods here, so thank you. Okay. How is the UK government responding to CBAM, and what steps do they need to take to confirm their position? I'd like to start with Laura, please.
So our take on that again is from the countries that we're working with, the least developed countries, BRICS, and lower middle income countries. And for many of the smaller countries such as Mozambique, which actually are quite strong aluminium exporters, there is a potential that their industry could be affected. At the moment, there isn't really much discussion about how to support countries, developing countries that are in a position of having some of their exports impacted. And at the same time, they're trying to invest in climate mitigation and also implementing more green energy. So that's just a sort of particular part of it that we at IID are working on.
Thank you. Chimdi?
So yeah, in terms of the UK government response, I think the UK published a consultation on potential mechanisms to combat carbon leakage, including CBAM, and that was earlier this year. And so that consultation is ongoing. It's a necessary step to kind of get feedback from industry and other stakeholders on what a UK mechanism could look like. In terms of kind of confirming the government's position, I think that an important step to take regarding CBAM is actually to sort out the UK emissions trading scheme first. The EU CBAM is there to enable the proper functioning of the EU ETS. So if the EU CBAM can ensure that EU firms won't be at a competitive disadvantage due to the costs paid under the EU ETS, then the EU can stop providing regulated companies with a huge proportion of their emissions trading allowances for free, which is currently what happens for most firms outside the power sector. And giving free allowances out fundamentally undermines the point of the mechanism, which is to price emissions. And so the UK, I think, in order to kind of confirm its position relating to a CBAM, really needs to have a kind of timeline for the phase out of free allocations under the UK ETS, because without that, you can't really provide much certainty about how a domestic CBAM would work. So that's my side.
Thank you. Everyone's being very succinct. I think we're going to be well above time, Jeff. Sorry, Chair. Luca.
So I mentioned these two phases, the monitoring phase and the compliance phase. So I believe that the immediate implication over the next couple of years for the UK, so during this monitoring phase, may be relatively minor. The UK has already a monitoring, the reporting verification mechanism in place for the carbon emissions. So complying with the CBAM requires really, during this period will just involve some administrative adjustments and additional paperwork. However, the critical consideration probably will come into play in the subsequent phase, and that will the UK's response to the CBAM and the action that should be taken or will be taken, I think, depends on predominantly trajectory of carbon pricing in UK, trajectory of those carbon pricing in Europe and globally. This will be a significant determinant, and additionally, any sort of discussion about potential linkage between the UK and ETS will be definitely important.
So, I'm no expert on this area, but are you saying that the issues will could potentially get wider if there's a divergence between the two?
Well, yes, if you take already, suppose that we are at the moment, suppose that starting from tomorrow, we are supposed to also have an adjustment, as in a cost. The price differential that we currently observe between the European system and the UK system will determine the adjustment that the European members will apply to whatever is imported in the UK. And that's a substantial price differential. So it's a really big cost on export.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Tamara. That's great. Charles, please.
Good morning. This question follows on from the points that Luca was just making about linkage, and it's actually to ask whether it would be feasible for the UK to introduce the CBAM without linking EU and UK ETS systems, and would UK-EU ETS linkage require a separate treaty? And I have sort of a further just add on to this, which is that I always wonder about the accuracy of these reporting systems and whether in fact whether they capture what it is indeed they're set out to literally to capture. Luca, can I start with you? Because
sure.
We're in full flow.
I think that from a technical standpoint, the UK can indeed introduce its own carbon border adjustment mechanism independently without actually linking with the EU ETS. However, feasibility, the question is about feasibility and effectiveness of such a UK CBAM, is closely tied to the way border adjustments are calculated or will be calculated in the future. So that very much depends on the price differential. So just to give you an example, suppose that again, we are in 2026, and we are in a situation when the UK ETS has a lower primary price than the European emission trading system. Basically today, that's the situation. Any UK CBAM would likely be constrained by the price levels that we have within the UK ETS. This is to remain competitive and also complying with the WTO. So you cannot actually charge something that is higher than the UK, than the price that you face in the UK. So any form of adjustment, I believe, will require some minimum level of alignment between the two systems, so between the UK ETS and the European ETS, in order to have an operating UK CBAM. And regarding the link, whether there will be a treaty, that I don't know. And regarding your further questions, capturing the real level of emissions, as I mentioned earlier, we have already a very well functioning monitoring, reporting, and verification system in place. So the European one and ETS one have been running for the past 15 years, basically.
But a further point is just how incentivized are people to make this accurate, or is there a?
Oh, sorry. So it will be. There is a default level of emission intensity that will be applied. Suppose you're not reporting anything, but you are importing stuff into Europe, or actually exporting stuff into Europe. There will be a default level of emission intensity that will be applied, and that default is basically a penalization. It will be the highest level of emission intensity with a supercharge of 40%.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful. Chimdi, can I turn this one to you?
Sure, yes, I would mainly just echo a lot of what Luca said about that in terms of, could the UK introduce its own system without linking with the EU ETS? Yes. Would it be kind of practical? For the businesses that will be subject to these regulations, I'd say it would be certainly better to have fewer systems in place. Also, kind of what Luca was talking about, kind of the premise of linking the UK and EU systems, the UK and EU systems, is based on them both looking somewhat similar, so that they're comparable and could be linked. And already after kind of 2 years of the systems being apart, we're seeing some kind of divergence, right? So this year, the EU prices ended up far higher than the UK price. We're seeing different approaches to the kind of sectors that will be covered under both systems. There's different approaches to the free allocation of emissions allowances. There's also different approaches to free allocation of emissions allowances. And so before we even talk about linkage, I think we need to kind of be sure over the next few years that that's even a practical option, because the systems don't look too differently. And then, of course, as Luca said, the incentive to more accurately report emissions is because the EU is ensuring that there's a very conservative estimate of the kind of emission factors or the emissions intensity of the production of certain goods, such that companies who do have more kind of efficient processes are incentivized to make sure they're collecting that data properly, so they're not penalized for not collecting the data with these conservative assumptions of what their emissions could be.
Okay, smashing. Thanks very much for that. And Laura, can you take this one up?
Yeah, just to add on that, I think it's the divergence issue from the perspective of developing countries. Obviously, the larger, more vocal and bigger trading partners, countries like China, have already been quite vocal about this in the WTO. But for smaller countries, compliance, they already face very high costs of trade. Being able to comply with a range of different regulations makes it much more difficult. And actually, probably the EU market is much bigger. So if they are, they're not huge global exporters, but they would be looking to export their goods into a bigger market. So they would be drawn to the EU, even if it might be slightly higher standard, higher price, but actually it would be much easier for them in terms of their volumes of trade.
That's very much a driver towards harmonization.
Yeah.
And are the voices there to drive this harmonization, or do we just continue with this diverging outlook?
So I think from certainly the least developed countries' perspective, they're sort of waking up to this. They've been more focused, I think, on the EU. Certainly, we've not really discussed with some of our interlocutors the UK system, because the focus has been on the EU so far. My guess is that UK partners in China, India, they are probably raising these points in bilateral trade discussions.
Thank you very much. And I think that's back to you, Chair.
Charles, thank you very much. And back to business, Tamara.
Thank you, Chair. Would businesses benefit from the UK aligning with the EU CBAM? In the absence of alignment, what adjustments would business need to make? I'll go to Luca first, please.
So I think in general, businesses could benefit from the introduction of a UK CBAM, but that very much depends on where they are located on the supply chain and the trade relation between Europe and UK. So allow me to do an oversimplification of the UK economy, and let's start considering businesses that predominantly operate in the UK domestic market. So upstream businesses that engage in importing carbon-intensive goods, they could actually potentially face adverse consequences, whereas downstream businesses involved in importing less carbon-intensive product may actually find themselves in a more favorable position, possibly even benefiting from any sort of alignment of the EU and UK CBAM. Now, for businesses that actually operate internationally, well, the advantage that they gain very much depends on the degree of the overall price alignment. So we're going back to what we said earlier. Simply designing a UK CBAM that is, from a pure design perspective, align to the European one doesn't prevent the possibility of actually being charged with a relatively high level of adjustment. So it appears, in my opinion, that some level of alignment of or dependence between the two systems, the two ETS system, could facilitate a corresponding alignment between the CBAM adjustment costs.
Thank you. Sorry, my phone is pinging and I realised that it's aligned to my computer, which is why I was turning myself to mute. Laura, please.
Yes, this is the other side of the divergence coin, and I think the example that Luca set out was a very good one around kinds of companies, the kind of trade they're involved in. But even given this would be a piece of legislation going down the supply chain, some of the products, as I mentioned before, aluminium, that are going into other things that are perhaps being processed in China, or things that are being made in Europe and then coming into the EU. There is an implication of this going down value chain. So even though some of the developing country exporters may be sort of small exporters in very specific sectors, and it's iron and steel, aluminium, some cement from North Africa. In those sectors, there could be quite significant impact. So alignment would help both those producer countries and, as you're hearing from Luca, make it easier for UK businesses that have got operations coming through Europe.
Thank you. Chimdi.
Yeah, I think what both Luca and Laura have to say is important. And so Luca focused on kind of the price differential and the actual costs of CBAM. I think another element kind of Laura is focusing on is just the reporting obligations of these companies. And so just looking at kind of what the EU has at the moment at a high level, right? Importers into the EU will need to kind of report information on their suppliers' production facilities, you know, the size of those facilities, some of the activities that happen in the facilities, the level of energy consumption, emission factors, waste gases, and other product-specific information. And then for some complex goods, importers will also need to somehow collect this information from the suppliers of their suppliers as well. And eventually, you know, companies will face penalties for doing this process incorrectly. And so, yes, my thinking here is that if the UK does decide to implement its own system, and if any of the data collection formats or if any of the emissions calculation methods are different to the EU, they diverge in any way, this is going to impose a significant burden on any firms that are importing from or exporting to the EU. And so from that perspective, alignment would actually be quite a positive thing, just so that we kind of there just isn't this like massively divergent international system of different kind of CBAM mechanisms. There's a huge amount that companies are having to do.
And just picking up on that, I'm assuming that the key point is that the major market is the EU for production here, and also I'm assuming with the work that Laura is talking about and the countries that she's working in, that the key wish is to build into the EU market because of the numbers. Am I getting this right? Because I think this is, even though I'm no expert on your area, I'm seeing similarities with evidence we've taken from other industries about the request for alignment. Have I got this right? Yeah, okay, great. Right, back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tamara. Chimdi, I do apologise for slipping in another question. You used the phrase significant impact. Could I ask you to qualify that or possibly even attempt to quantify it in any way?
When you say significant impact in terms of the regulatory burden on firms, is that what you're referring to? Is that
yes, it is.
I think it would be dangerous for me to try to quantify at the moment, but what I can say is, you know, working with companies, again, only at this early stage of CBAM where it's just reporting obligations, a lot of firms are not going to have the in-house capacity to either calculate the emissions themselves or to engage with the suppliers upstream in their supply chain in order to get those suppliers to report emissions accurately along the lines of the EU methodologies, right? And so there's going to be a lot of using outside consultants, hiring additional people to understand your emissions in your supply chain. And so I don't know exactly what the cost would be, but having seen these methodologies, it is complex. There will need to be lawyers involved. There will need to be engineers involved to look at the facilities. And a lot of companies, whether they're in the EU or in kind of EU trade markets, do not have the capacity to collect the data in the way that they'll need to right now. And so when I say significant, I mean there may be, you know, changes to your operations, changing to your hiring schemes, things like that.
Great, thank you very much. Moving on to the next question, if I may, Philippa.
Thanks very much, Chair. Obviously, we've heard throughout the Brexit debates and since Brexit that often the UK government expressed that they feel they could go further, set higher standards, and an ideological objection to alignment. So you've already all touched on it a bit, but is it really practical for the UK to continue without any attempt to align the ETS and CBAM mechanisms? If I can have Chimdi, Luca, and then Laura.
Sure. I think generously, it could be a valid position to take. So, for example, UK authorities have been more positive about the potential inclusion of engineered carbon removals in the UK ETS than EU officials have been. And so one could take this point and say, you know, if one believes that a reluctant EU could maybe prevent the UK from, say, adding more sectors to the UK ETS, then maybe to some extent the EU could hold back the UK, right? However, there's really no evidence that the UK would be far more ambitious than the EU would want to be. We've spoken before, the EU price is far higher than the UK one at the moment. The EU is on track to stop giving out free emissions allowances before the UK. And the EU is also on track to kind of add additional sectors to the ETS before the UK is. So if I would just want to make sure that kind of anyone making this point about the UK being able to go further, I just want to make sure they were making that point in good faith. One other point I would make is the EU CBAM at the moment might be quite hard on businesses. I keep saying that the methodologies are complex. And so possibly the main step that I'd want the UK to be taking right now is just kind of learning from what's happening in the EU. And if the UK does choose to go it alone, potentially thinking about how a system could be designed in a way that's maybe better than what the EU has put out at the moment. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Before we move on, can I also add in, are there other things that the UK needs to start looking at? I mean, it's very striking that the UK doesn't include emissions from transport. It doesn't include its external carbon, whereas obviously other countries do look at what their total carbon reduction is. So when we hear the UK has reduced carbon emissions by 42%, that doesn't include any of the, big ships coming from China or whatever else. So are there not things where it also has to just put its house in order so that when it's doing more of these things, it's more comprehensive to start with?
Yeah, I would say so. I think this kind of relates to what I was saying earlier about before we were even talking about CBAM, we kind of need to ensure that the UK ETS is fit for purpose. And that is one aspect that that was released in the UK ETS report this year. We will be bringing shipping into the UK ETS in future, although it's only ships up to a certain size, and so quite a lot of shipping emissions are still going to be excluded there. But yeah, I would agree with the statement broadly that yes, I think the focus does need to be about making sure that the UK ETS is a key aspect of the kind of net zero transition. At the moment, it's not really been serving that purpose.
Okay, thank you. And Luca?
I think that it is possible for the UK not to link with the EU ETS and the CBAM, but I think we need to identify the potential consequences, and I think some of them are already quite self-evident.
It's whether it's practical.
Yeah.
It might be ideologically, but is it something government should seriously think of doing?
Exactly. Let me talk about the practical. I mean, whether it's practical not to, or actually without actually sort of linking. Let's go back to that example. So, there will be a price differential, and the way currently the directive, the CBAM directive, consider a potential calculation of the adjustment is based on what is defined to be an equivalent carbon price, and that's crystal clear in Article 3, I think, what is a price, what is an explicit price. It is basically the price that we currently see in UK and is currently the price that we see in Europe. There will be adjustments for sure, I mean, changes, but that's pretty much it. So I think that suppose that we don't want to do any sort of linking. So if establishing a direct link is deemed unattainable, what we could do probably is a proactive measure to counteract the potential adverse impact of these of the scenario I was just describing. So what for example, UK can do, and Chimbi alluded to that. So some sort of reform or modification of the UK, one potential avenue is actually a proactive management of the supply of allowances. So where you control your own allowances so that you try to control this price differential. We have already actually within the current existing UK ETS provisions that do that. The auction reserve price is a possible way to do that. But I think it's important to recognize, again, going back to your point about practicality, it's important to recognize that although reforming the UK ETS might be a less intricate and politically challenging path, it remains a very complex undertaking. So I think it's really important to understand that you might think it's easier to do that, but it's still very complicated and complex to do that. For example, we eventually decide not to have a market adjustment system in UK that would have been replicating what currently is existing in Europe. Also, if we take that avenue, the two systems will substantially diverge, and that divergence potentially might again enlarge that price differential. So, and obviously go and work against any sort of linking. So I'm not entirely sure this is a practical avenue.
And Laura?
Sorry, thank you. Yes, I think that the things that I would sort of pick up in this are the idea of sort of going further suggests higher standards, and as I was saying earlier, many developing countries are very critical about the way that the EU CBAM is being introduced, and it's sort of green protection is being talked about. And I think if the UK were to go down a route and say, yes, we're going further, we're going to have a more stringent regime, then it would really need to ensure that it was having a good diplomatic dialogue with affected countries, particularly developing countries, to explain why they were taking this approach and the sort of how it linked into their other policies around climate change. And as we've just been hearing, our own house in order on the ETS is sort of an area where we might look, if we were taking that approach as the UK, we might look that we don't have our house in order. Again, as was just mentioned, one of the key areas is this sort of phase out of the free allowances under the EU scheme, and that again is something that is sort of seen to support that this being a sort of a strong environmental move and not some kind of green protections. And so that's something else that would need to go alongside any sort of UK higher ambition CBAM. And then there's a debate, and I'll sort of say a bit more about this in response to some of the next questions, that potentially exempting exports or products going from least developed countries and climate vulnerable countries into global supply chains that are ending up in the UK. The exemption is a sort of tricky slope to go down, but thinking about how potentially the revenues from actually the collection of the CBAM at the UK border, that could be used to support those countries actually being able to comply. So having to be able to reduce their costs and to actually to help grow their domestic industries. So a couple of other sort of sets of issues around the UK going its own route. Thank you.
Obviously, that's really the key issue. Many of the countries in the global south are much more affected by climate change and therefore, understand it to a physical degree, often more than we do. But it's trying to get that circularity of actually supporting them to change.
Yeah, and I think that's way, rather than a sort of going down an exemption route, going down a route of collecting the revenues and then using that for technical assistance, and that's an issue that the EU CBAM is still not sort of very, very clear on. So that would be one thing that the UK were going to do something different, or even whatever the UK does, that is something that should really consider.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Philippa. That's appreciated. Alan, if you may.
Yes, thank you very much, panel. One of the other arguments that has been sort of introduced to prevent alignment is that if the UK aligns with the EU in various ways, it makes relations with other countries more difficult. So I'd like to ask, to the extent, presuming that the UK chooses to introduce a CBAM and align its ETS with the EU, so that we really are basically within the EU system, what are the potential difficulties that raises with other countries? I guess in a sense you've answered this already, Laura, but let me start with you if you want to enlarge at all on that answer.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, I actually, and my colleagues might who have more technical understanding of the UK and EU systems might be able to sort of offer more on this, but I would say that by and large, certainly from the countries that we engage with, that there wouldn't be disbenefits of the UK aligning with the EU. Obviously, if there were particular bilateral trade deals that the UK was trying to do with countries, and India has been quite an elusive one, but I'm not sure I can see how the UK could offer something under a bilateral deal with India. There's supposed to be reciprocity in trade deals, so it's very difficult to see where there may be benefits for other countries that the UK is trading with, the UK doing its own scheme.
Thank you. Chimdi.
Yeah, maybe similar to what Laura was just saying. I think that the potential tension, international tension, comes from the existence or the implementation of kind of CBAM itself, but it's not necessarily different if the UK chooses or doesn't choose to align with the EU. I think that also on what Laura was saying, there's a potential opportunity, whether or not the UK aligns with the EU, an opportunity on mitigating the impact of CBAM to developing economies. I think that, as Laura said, the text in the EU regulation is incredibly vague about kind of giving some technical assistance and monitoring the impacts. And so whether or not the UK is aligned, the UK could choose to go further in terms of providing that technical assistance, providing that finance. So I think that's something to focus on. And again, regardless of whether there's alignment or not, we are going to see some degree of tension because of CBAM. A lot of commentators are still not even sure if CBAM will be ultimately implemented. There's going to be continuing challenges in the World Trade Organization. India, I think, has already kind of threatened a retaliatory measure relating to it. But I think ultimately, if CBAM if it's implemented, if it works as intended, it will encourage other countries to set up their own emissions trading schemes. Many of these countries will then need to set up their own CBAMs or supply their own kind of financial packages to protect domestic firms. And so this will also induce tension in the same way that the US Inflation Reduction Act has kind of upset a lot of EU officials for kind of having domestic protections embedded in that. So I think there'll be tension regardless. I'm not sure how much the tension will be specifically related to whether the UK aligns with the EU or not with its system.
Thank you. Luca.
I don't think suggested. I think I would just note one thing. UK trade partners closely resemble European trade partners. In fact, EU is one of the largest UK partner beyond China, US, and Switzerland. So given this similarity, I wouldn't anticipate significantly different responses from those partners compared to the action that we currently witness in response to the introduction of a European CBAM.
Okay, thank you. Since you're also commendably brief, I'm going to try and steal an extra bit of time and ask a supplementary. So the US has got a completely different approach to this. And we're sort of seeing it in their proposals about steel and aluminium. Why don't you come into a little club? Is the argument that we've heard in so many other cases that indeed we're going to not bother with Europe, we actually are going to align with the US. Is that at all a credible position for a UK government to adopt? So I'm sorry, no notice of that, but if anybody wants to wave their hand and contribute, I'd be very interested to hear.
Maybe can I address this by also adding one thing, because I think it's really important to recognize that the key objective of these type of border carbon adjustments are primarily preventing carbon leakage. This is the mission number one. And mission number two is preserving industrial competitiveness. Now, in that respect, I think it's really interesting to observe that the way EU navigated the diplomatic relationship with other nations, in particular with the US, there was this outcome where now US is willing to withdraw their objection about the EU CBAM as part of this ongoing negotiation aimed at establishing the Green Steel Club. So clubs are a very different but yet similar linking agreement. So that idea, I think, is quite it's quite interesting. So understanding to what extent you can be part of a club or more precisely link your system, I think is extremely important to understand to what extent you can reduce this price differential. At the end of the day, this type of adjustment are about what exactly you're implementing domestically and what can be considered to be equivalent to what is currently implemented in Europe or in the UK.
Okay, thank you. Chimdi, have you Anything to add?
I think that beyond kind of potentially joining a carbon club, I think it's just more of just a point of interest about the kind of different approaches to climate regulation in the EU, UK, and US. And it is, the US obviously has a very different political system, very different political landscape, but it just so happens that it is not politically feasible in the US to implement a nationwide emissions trading scheme, right? That people have been trying for decades, and the only way that those who are interested in climate action can really get it through is by passing these huge subsidy packages, right? But even those subsidy packages, and we look at kind of the billions of dollars involved, and they're great, but they will still face regulatory hurdles to be implemented. The funding will still need to be kind of approved each year, and there's no guarantee that the kind of emission savings that are kind of the potential emission savings that are bandied about when the subsidy packages are released will actually come to fruition, because they can be, the funding and the implementation can be blocked at various stages at the national and state level. And so I think the US approach does often look quite attractive, but I think having a solid, robust regulatory mechanism in place, like an emissions trading scheme, I do ultimately think is a better path to be going down. And I think it is a good thing that the UK and the EU have emissions trading schemes that are underpinning the emissions reduction and net zero strategies, as opposed to every few years putting out as much money as you can get away with, which is kind of what the Americans do. So that would be my point there.
I would entirely agree. Laura.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I'd add to that is that the sort of the club approach in other areas of sort of leading countries wanting to come together and do things, again, tends to send alarm bells to countries in the global south with concerns around green protectionism, or trying to go sort of further, faster alone, and then leaving countries behind. And so that would be my only sort of additional comment on going down the route of the US approach.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me pass back to Jeff. Thank you.
Alan, thanks very much. That added quite a lot of value, I thought. I really appreciate that. Stephen, to conclude this session, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and good morning to all of our witnesses. Yes, as Jeff says, I'm asking our traditional final catch-all question, which is to ask each of you to maybe just encapsulate your evidence as briefly as possible for us in a summary format, and to either give us either the 3 key points you want us to take away, or the 3 key recommendations that we should take away. So I'll start with Laura, please.
Thank you. Yes, I think the first thing, particularly coming from the perspective of the least developed countries and climate vulnerable countries, is that the revenues that are collected at the border related to their exports or their imports into the EU should be invested in supporting their green economic just transition. So that's important, particularly when we're looking at the costs of addressing climate change being far beyond what domestic revenues or aid are going to provide, and leveraging private finance is a big part of the debate. Something like this is not going to provide huge resources, but anything that does help that actually helps to ensure the countries can spend on health, education, and social spending. The second sort of related point is where I mentioned sort of products that are coming into, say, the UK from the EU, that when sort of the approach of looking down the supply chain to the primary producers, and then the products going through several different countries, that actually thinking about where the primary products are coming from. This is particularly the case with bauxite and aluminium, so that the whole supply chain approach is taken, and that is more complex. We've been hearing about the complexity of the system from others, but that's an important part of ensuring, again, that some of the lower income countries as primary producers of goods are integrated into these systems. And then the other is sort of the UK has historically been a leader on sort of trade and development issues, and that in its thinking about development of its ETS and CBAM, that it should really try to ensure that it maintains that integrity, and in implementing its environmental policies, it thinks about the developmental implications of that. So those would be three things that I would be advocating for the UK to think about in the development of its CBAM. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura, and over to Chimdi.
Thank you. So I think the 3 points here, so would have mentioned all of these at some point before, but the first one I would say is to sort out the UK ETS first. I think that means having a clear roadmap for how the system is going to develop in terms of the sectors that are going to be covered, in terms of how free allocations are going to be covered, and then with that as a foundation, laying out how CBAM will be designed to fit into that vision and to facilitate the further development of the system. So the first point would be to sort out the UK ETS. The second point would be to use this consultation process to properly understand industry, the companies that are going to be affected by CBAM, understand what it will mean for businesses in terms of the reporting obligations, the potential financial costs, and the ways in which the government can potentially lighten the load, either with a different policy design or with technical assistance down the line. And then the final point would be to learn from what is currently happening in the EU, learn from the implementation in the EU. So I think underlying this kind of session is being sure the UK is somewhat behind the EU in terms of ambition when it comes to carbon pricing. But I think this is definitely a case in which being a follower comes with opportunities. And I don't think the UK government should waste this opportunity to see what's happening with the EU and how, either if we're linking or we're going with our own system, how we can ensure that it is better, more effective, and easier on businesses going forwards. So those would be my 3 points.
Sure, thank you very much. And over to you, Luca, to have the final word.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so maybe reiterating some of the things I was mentioning earlier. So given this intertwined nature of the UK and the European economies, I think the potential and also the potential implications of a European CBAM, I think it would be prudent for the UK to consider a UK version of a CBAM as aligned as possible to the European CBAM. I believe that this alignment would help control potential market distortion, and crucially, and this is Chimbi already mentioned that, it will also simplify compliance work for companies that actually operate in both regions. Whether we go for a UK CBAM or not, I think is also important for the UK to develop a clear transition plan that outlines our intent to either integrate or design our own CBAM, or integrate the CBAM in the existing ETS, or even start a negotiation or a consideration of linking. And the last one is what exactly Laura mentioned, I think engage in trade and environmental conversation. I think that UK should engage in diplomatic effort to coordinate, perhaps even together with Europe, other major trading partners. I think it's also more important to notice that after a much more credible discussion about CBAM, the number of countries and jurisdictions that have implemented an ETS, an explicit carbon price, whether an ETS or a carbon price, carbon tax, have been growing quite significantly. So CBAM, the old policy, the old threat of an introduction of an adjustment via the trade mechanism has been quite effective, I think, in the introduction of or actually forcing, in a way, other countries to implement similar things. And I would, at this point, also, I wouldn't entirely disregard the possibility to resume or actually start a conversation about linking the two systems, the European one and the UK one. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks to all three of you. And back to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Stephen. A really interesting session on something that is very strategic. I think I've heard a lot of words about complexity, funding, costs, and regulatory hurdles as we move forward with this area. We've got time for a short break before our next session, which will look at net zero and the UK's trading conversation on ETS. So could we have a short break for a few minutes? Please fill your cups, and I'll see you back here a couple of minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us on the second half of this morning's evidence session. A really interesting start today, looking and examining some of the conversations around CBAM. And we're going to move on in our second session, looking at net zero and ETS. To start the session off, and before the first question, could I take the opportunity to both welcome the witnesses and ask them to introduce themselves, please. As always in these things, could I ask both commissioners and answerers to be pithy and sharp during our session, please. That's always appreciated. Thank you very much. Could we start, please, with Gudrun?
Hello, I'm Gudrun Cartwright, and I am the Climate Action Director at Business in the Community, which is a network of over 600 businesses focused on creating a fairer and greener world led by fairer and greener businesses. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. Ethan.
Hello, good morning. Thanks for having me today. I'm Esin Serin. I'm a policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. We are based at the London School of Economics. I focus on UK climate policy and sustainable growth. And I work really closely with colleagues at the Centre for Economic Performance, where we try to identify the UK's comparative advantages in green technologies to look at how the UK can capture growth opportunities as it transitions to net zero. And to today's conversation, I'll try to bring that sort of industrial policy and growth opportunity perspective to trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Esin. Practicality, pragmatism, and looking at things is always helpful. Johnny.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'm Johnny Peters. I'm a senior policy advisor covering trade at the climate change think tank E3G, which is based here in London, but also in Brussels, Berlin and DC. So pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. Welcome to all of you. And we move on to our first question. Deborah, please.
Thank you very much indeed. And it has been a really interesting session, and hopefully this is going to be equally interesting. So my first question is, to what extent is the UK's trading landscape, which of course has changed in recent years, compatible with the UK's net zero goals, which of course are net zero by 2050? So Esin, could we start with you first, do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so to this broad question, making the UK's trade and landscape compatible with net zero should mean both ensuring the UK is trading the things and in a way to deliver its own net zero goals, but also in a way to capture economic opportunities from the global efforts to reduce emissions. The UK's current trade and landscape requires further progress on both of those aspects. As we know, net zero means an economy-wide technological transformation, and that means incumbent fossil fuel-based technologies will need to be replaced really fast by low-carbon technologies at massive scale. And just as an illustration, the International Energy Agency forecasted that global electric car sales will grow 18-fold by the end of this decade. Of course, that kind of export opportunity is not just the UK. Many countries are already thinking about both getting their hands on enough of these technologies to deliver their domestic emissions reduction targets, but also which of these technologies they can produce competitively to capture growth opportunities from these growing export markets. And we are now operating in new economic and geopolitical realities. And we're actually seeing some divergence from that fundamental principle of the modern trade system, which would suggest production should happen where it's the most economically efficient. The US, in particular, with its Inflation Reduction Act, seems to have started this new age of green protectionism, as it provides explicit support for some domestic industries of green technologies, perhaps at the expense of efficiency, but it's in support of its own energy security and wider domestic economic objectives, which notably includes leveling up some leveling up deprived communities.
I'm going to stop you there, Esin, because I want to come to the other
right, sorry.
the other experts. And I am very conscious of Jeff's words of pithiness. So Gudrun and then Johnny.
I would say that, the UK is now in a position after leaving the EU to create new trade deals and to make sure those align with the net zero commitments that we've made. So making sure that we think about those commitments and those new trade deals in tandem is important. But also what we're seeing from our members is that having to operate in multiple jurisdictions around the world and having different requirements can be really challenging. So I think the UK has really been a leader in this, and others are now coming up behind us and becoming much more ambitious. So I think for the UK to maintain that position and give UK businesses the certainty that what they're doing at home is going to put them in good stead overseas is really important.
Can I just ask a kind of supplementary to that? If you have trade deals which basically are based much further afield than what we had with the EU, because the EU just geographically is closer to the UK, doesn't that by itself make it more difficult to reach the net zero target if you're having to trade further away from your front door? Or is that just a very simplistic way of looking at things?
It's a really good question. I would say that one of the big sticking points, one of the big sort of elephants in the room around trade is the aviation and shipping is not really included in anybody's calculations of emissions. So wherever things are coming from, we need to think about who owns that. And I think that this is my response to one of the other questions around, the UK's owning of its emissions is around that whole piece of what's ours and what somebody else's. And I think it's true. There's a real opportunity to onshore things as well and think about how we can make things in the UK and export them. But there's a really difficult balance between the ability to support developing markets to build their own infrastructure for net zero and to do things in a way that helps us to meet our targets, as well as thinking about how we create new opportunities for people in the UK. So there's so many different social and environmental aspects at play that it's not easy. There's no straightforward answer to these questions, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, Johnny.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think I might use this question just as a chance to do a bit of scene setting as well. So I think, it's worth recognising that the UK has obviously only had an independent trade policy post-Brexit, and that's not a particularly long period of time still. And the UK's headline priorities have been, as many of you already know, to kind of roll over EU trade agreements into UK trade agreements as fast as possible. And then secondly, to set up as many trade deals essentially as possible to diversify UK trade post-Brexit away from the EU. And it's fair to say, I think, that green trade has fallen in as a lesser priority amongst those two kind of higher goals. But that's not to say that hasn't featured as a priority. So we saw in 2021 that the Board of Trade, then under Liz Truss, interestingly enough, published its report on green trade, and that was ahead of COP26, probably as the driving force for that. I think what's interesting in the Board of Trade report is that they kind of major on the ways in which trade liberalisation can support green trade. So they point to, for instance, the kind of UK global tariff, which in 2020 removed tariffs on over 100 green goods. And so we can see how the intersection of the liberalisation agenda and the green trade agenda kind of worked for the UK in that context. But where the Board of Trade was particularly weak was on this competitiveness dimension, which Esin kind of already pointed to. We saw, for instance, in the Board of Trade report, Board of Trade members essentially using it as an opportunity to kind of dismiss CBAMs as kind of green protectionism without really diving into any of the detail around why these measures might be warranted. And I think particularly in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and the European Union's responses the competitiveness dimension of green trade is kind of rising to the top of political agendas worldwide, but it's notable that that's not really the case in the UK at the moment. And the UK is failing, I think, to come up with an adequate response to the rise of industrial strategy globally. I think this is where we kind of need to see an evolution in the UK's thinking in this space in terms of how we talk about green trades. I think if there's one area that I point to in terms of where the UK actually has more of a positive story to tell, that's been around export promotion and the role of UK export finance in this space. So ahead of COP26, the UK's export credit agency, UKEF, made a clear decision to stop financing fossil fuels internationally and use this as an opportunity to bring other countries with the UK around this at COP26. And we saw the previous Trade Secretary, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, really major on this in terms of her definition of what green trade is for the UK, and that was really positive to see. But I think, unfortunately, just to wrap up on this, I think we haven't really seen a clear vision on what green trade is from Kemi Badenoch, the current Trade Secretary. Instead, I think we've seen the government looking again back to its original priorities, diving ahead in terms of CPTPP accession, the India trade deal, and increasingly I think we're going to see with the Gulf Cooperation Council as well, essentially sidelining green criteria in terms of going for those higher goals that I kind of mentioned before. And each of those in order, I would say, increasingly at odds with the UK's net zero transition at home.
That was incredibly helpful. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Charles, please.
Thanks, Jeff. My question is about how much the world trade system, and I think the earlier speakers have indicated there's a degree of flux in this, supports the transition to net zero, and what level of confidence do you have that the current initiatives, either at a global level, support this, and also in relation to the UK? Can I ask Ezin to start with this one, please?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, many here will already be familiar. There are many platforms where it's been tried to make the global trade system compatible with the delivery of global net zero emissions. And that's notably under the World Trade Organization and its recent launch of the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. And now we get work explicitly on aligning international standards by the International Sustainability Standards Board. And then more recently, the Coalition of Trade Ministers for Climate Action was launched with an aim to bring trade ministers from around the world to work together on that nexus between climate and trade. But despite this complex landscape of initiatives, platforms, and dialogues that do exist, I'm not confident that current efforts are sufficient to fully align the world trade system with the transition to net zero. And that's down to two main worries. The first is the pace. The examples illustrate there's a lot of dialogue, and there have been attempts in the past to reach this common definition of what an environmental good is and should be. But the pace at which that dialogue translates to action, if any, is simply too slow. And that's probably not unique to trade or even climate, but just an inherent aspect of international diplomacy, which would bring me to my to the second worry, which is on fairness, as my fellow witnesses have already touched upon as well. It's difficult to achieve international agreement on trade, given how different countries are coming at this question from a whole set of different priorities and circumstances. But that shouldn't mean developed economies unilaterally act to favor cleaner producers in a way that simply transfers market share into developed economies and leave developing economies behind. Instead, we should have inclusive international dialogue and support for developing countries' ability to compete in international trade in a net zero world. And that's just in recognition of developed countries' historical responsibility in global emissions. And the UK actually has a moral responsibility to use its voice and its historically strong diplomatic skills in international forums to work towards that fair outcomes internationally.
Thank you. I think that's given us a flavour for some of the competition in here. Gudrun, can I move this one on to you and see what do you have to add to this?
Of course, thank you. So I would say that there's no white paper for how we're going to get to net zero and how we're going to align these trading and tackling the climate emergency in a fair way. So the key thing that we hear is that business leaders, they need clarity on the journey. So, and they're very keen to be able to work across their global operations to make things happen with their suppliers. So, for example, Sky have been working with the manufacturers in China to co-invest in solar panels on the roof so that they're both getting the benefits of being able to deliver lower carbon goods and lower costs for both businesses. But that's not as a result of the way the world trade system is working. It's as a result of leadership from an individual company. So I don't think that the world trade system supports the transition at the moment. And there's some, there's an element of world leaders needing to think about this in a collaborative sense of it's a shared global challenge that we all need to get to. And all of the severe weather events we've seen over the last few years are showing us that we need to work together. So this becomes a non-competitive issue. How do world leaders in a political, in a business, in civil society do that and come together so that we can have a just transition that means that we are getting to net zero, we're building resilience, and we're lifting people out of poverty as a result of the transition, because it feels a bit like at the moment there's an assertion being made that we can't do both, and I think we can. So I think it doesn't at the moment, but it can, and it really requires joined up leadership.
Thank you. I think that really highlights the problem of collective action across territories, across industries, and the competition between the various objectives in this whole piece. But thank you for that. Johnny, what do you add to this?
Yeah, similar reflections, I think, in terms of the WTO has certainly been slow to respond to climate issues. Its ministerial conference in 2022 was only the first time the WTO even managed to mention climate change in an outcome statement, just to give you a sense of how slow things are. I think there is increasing appetite, though, for the WTO to do more on trade and environmental sustainability. We've also heard already mentioned the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, the TESD, the plastics discussion, and the fossil fuel subsidy reform discussions, all very useful kind of own initiatives that are running in this space, and they're valuable. But I think I would say these are largely official level discussions, generally quite technical. I think really what we're lacking here at the moment is a real kind of political uplift and efforts in terms of agenda shaping, in terms of the overall way in which trade and climate is discussed at the WTO. And basically, just to echo in this respect, a lot of support for the new Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate that was launched in January this year. And I think that's really going to start plugging this important political gap at the WTO level. We'll be seeing more in terms of initial priorities, potential outcomes for the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate by the time of the next ministerial conference in February, coming up in 2024. And I'm hopeful that the UK will continue to support some of this and bring, like I said before, some of those areas where the UK has a positive story to tell, bring that up to that forum and that discussion to get other countries to move with the UK, for instance, on clean export promotion that I mentioned before.
But what you say suggests that there's a degree of flip-flopping here and movement up and down the agenda and priority map, if I can call it that, and then a degree of reliance on organizations like the WTO to implement policies or to design and implement policies. And I wonder what level of confidence you've got in that as a mechanism for driving this agenda.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the WTO's role is evolving at the moment. I think it's fair to say. And I think increasingly for issues like this, I think we increasingly can start to think of the WTO as more of a venue as much as anything else, rather than a particular kind of rule-making forum for discussions in this space. So we know that ministers want to go to the WTO. We know that developing countries attend in earnest still at the WTO. Important actors like China still attend and engage regularly at the WTO. So it's a very useful convening space for a lot of this stuff. I think what we're missing, like I mentioned before, is a clearer sense of how we're going to use this politically. And I think there's more of an uptake now in ministers wanting to say and do things on green trade. I think there's less of a clarity in terms of what that really looks like and what that really is. But this is why I think agenda setting is really important. And new initiatives like this Coalition of Trade Ministers, I think, will be incredibly helpful.
Thanks very much. Can I hand back to the chair? Jeff?
Thanks very much, Charles. Can we move on to Mike, please?
Thanks, Chair. And my question, I think, has already been touched on several times by speakers, but perhaps you can kind of elaborate a little bit. I'm interested to know whether you think that the UK takes a holistic view of trade emissions, and whether the UK could be doing more to take tangible steps to reduce emissions as part of trade deals. Could I turn to Gudrun first, please?
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that seems clear to me is that the way that we operate our accounting of emissions is all about our domestic emissions. So in the UK, we imported over £900 billion worth of goods in 2022, but we don't fully account for the emissions of those goods. We certainly don't in what we say our carbon footprint is, and what we measure our performance against. And so when I look at the businesses we work with, they're all looking at their scope 3 emissions, which is the stuff that's not under their direct control. And if the UK could start to incorporate its consumption-based emissions into its targets, into its measurement of its own performance, that would be groundbreaking. And I think as we are now becoming a country that is making trade deals on its own, in the future, as this becomes much more of a pressing issue, and we've talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, we've talked about China, countries that manufacture the stuff for us are going to want us potentially to own our emissions as part of trade deals, because they're going to become something that has value or cost as we move forward. So I think at the moment we don't, but I think we could and we should be starting to do that.
So crucial to incorporate an understanding of the emissions caused by our consumption into our understanding of our footprint. Johnny, can I turn to you for some thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, definitely. Only to basically endorse all of that. I totally agree. So to go back to the original question, does the UK take a holistic view of the emissions caused by trade? The short answer is no. And to be fair, by the exception of one possible exception, which is Sweden, I don't think any other countries globally do. And I think this is because traditionally under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, countries report on and set their climate targets on a territorial basis, so within the bounds of their country, rather than on a consumption basis, as has been said before, so considering the emissions of their imports from other countries. I think it's really important that countries do increasingly start to consider the emissions of their imports. The UK's consumption emissions footprint, for instance, would be 40% higher than is currently stated on a territorial basis if we do account for our consumption-based emissions, so including our imports. And I would say excitingly in this space, the UK's Committee on Climate Change, the CCC, is now starting to consider consumption emissions in the context of its next carbon budgets process for the UK, for setting the UK's future climate targets. And we know that the UK's 2008 Climate Change Act and its carbon budgets process is truly world leading and has done a lot to, I think, set the agenda globally in terms of how other countries have then followed. And I think there's a lot of potential for the UK to start using this framework to increasingly start incorporating consumption-based emissions accounting under this framework, to then set a bit more of a precedent globally for other countries to follow. In terms of what this could sort of tangibly sort of mean, I think for the trade space, I think one way in which an increased consumption-based emissions focus could be really useful would be in the context of impact assessments for trade deals. So if we could have more of a robust view of how a proposed trade deal would impact on the UK's consumption-based emissions footprint, we could then have a much clearer sense of the impacts and the methods that we can take to then address these impacts. Because as mentioned before earlier in the conversation, it's not necessarily clear-cut in terms of how far away a certain country is in terms of whether the emissions footprint increases, because it depends on how that product is produced in a country. So a country could be really far away, but they could have a very clean energy grid. And so actually overall, you know, those imports and so on might actually end up being cleaner than some imports that were made closer to the UK but were made using coal power, for instance. So it's not that clear cut, and I think it's very useful to have more robust data and accounting to support us taking clearer action in this space.
Thank you. So kind of detailed and robust emissions assessment as part of trade deals as a tangible step to improve that picture. Esin, have you anything to add to that?
I would just really echo what's already been said. Yeah, a holistic view of emissions caused by trade does require the UK to aim to reduce its consumption as well as its territorial emissions. And I guess I would add whether regardless of the UK taking that holistic view or not, part of the problem is being solved anyway by the UK's trade and partners increasing their own emissions reductions targets. The Climate Change Committee made a calculation a few years ago within its sixth carbon budget, and even at the time it found that around half of the UK's imported emissions were already from territories that already or were due to be covered by net zero targets. But even so, the UK's consumption emissions have been falling slower than the UK's territorial emissions. So yes, there's certainly more the UK can do for emissions reductions in trade deals. Yeah, on that, I know that carbon markets and border adjustment mechanisms have been discussed in detail in the previous session. So I guess another way to approach that question is the UK working with trade and partners explicitly to achieve similarly ambitious emissions reductions within respective borders, and that would really serve to reduce the risk of carbon leakage in its tracks. And some specific proposals to achieve that outcome include minimum environmental standards for imports, removal of trade barriers to environmental goods and services, and also requiring credible net zero targets and plans from any potential future free trade agreement partners. Also, I would also like to echo the part on whether we're able to properly account for our consumption emissions. That sort of holistic view should really adopt the principle of you can't improve what you can't measure, and really aim to improve the quality of the UK's consumption emissions data, which is inherently complex to measure. And even though it's a recommendation to adopt a consumption emissions reduction target is being proposed by various actors, I think the Climate Change Committee has been reluctant to recommend that for that reason, because it's so difficult to measure and monitor. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of the panel for that.
Thank you, Mike. Paul, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. And I wanted to ask something fairly specific around a key sector, the automotive sector, which has probably faced bigger challenges any post-Brexit. And the UK strategy was to try to build on some potentially competitive advantages that we had in relation to the transition to electric vehicles, although that's a bit up in the air after the Prime Minister's recent announcement on the transition date. But I'm conscious that in a couple of months, the rules of origin are going to tighten up substantially on batteries. Now, there might be some delay in that, there might be some grace period, but I guess what I'd like from panelists is some sense of how far we can realistically have any competitive advantage in this sector? What's the viability of the sector in the longer term? And perhaps I'll start with Yasin.
Yeah, thank you. On this, I would clarify, I'm not an expert on the rules of origin in particular, but I could talk to the overall landscape. And yeah, so far the UK has been late in the game to try and capture the opportunities from the transition to electric vehicles. And as you've pointed out already, the UK car manufacturing as a whole was already on a decline since 2016. So it's a post-Brexit related issue. Then it dates prior to the increased explicit climate related support for EVs from international competitors like the US and the EU. Like, sure, the Inflation Reduction Act is going to have an effect, but it was an ongoing issue anyway for the UK's automotive industry. And yeah, the UK also appears to have failed to be proactive in laying the foundations for a future EV industry. Again, as you've pointed out, that's about battery supply chains. The UK currently only has one operational plant for battery manufacturing and has seen a planned gigafactory go into administration earlier this year. Only recently, Tata Group has committed to invest in a major new gigafactory in the UK. But when we compare that to the EU, the EU has already seen plans for, I've seen different numbers on this, but between 35 and 50 gigafactories being announced already. So in terms of the viability of the sector long term, there appears to be one clear action that's needed, and that's long-term certainty for business to invest in the future EV industry in the UK. And that needs to include proactive thinking about the resilience of supply chains, especially when it comes to critical products like batteries. And that's going to be about stronger international cooperation and also actions to enable smoother trade with trade-in partners, and special effort to remain part of the European supply chains. It's also really hard not to comment on the Prime Minister's recent speech in this question. So that kind of delay to the phase out of the sale of petrol or diesel cars from 2030 to 2035. But this kind of watering down of well-established targets is a real threat to business confidence and appetite to invest in the UK. And while we should absolutely aim to deliver the net zero transition in a fair way, allowing consumers to buy a petrol vehicle post 2030 does not actually help with the cost of living crisis today. And it probably doesn't even change how fast EVs will be adopted in the UK, because the costs are changing in favor of EVs over petrol vehicles anyway, both in terms of upfront and operational costs. And then the government is also keeping the zero emission vehicle mandate in place. So the manufacturers are going to have to transition their fleets towards EVs anyway. So I can't really see any clear benefits either for consumers or industry from this kind of diluting the demand side signal. It will just likely make it harder for the UK to capture the industrial and export opportunities from the transition to EVs. So I would say that for long-term viability, this kind of start-stop approach should absolutely be avoided.
And obviously gives none of the certainty that you said was essential for business. You said you were hesitant in answering that question, but that was a very comprehensive response. So thank you for that. But Gudrun, is there anything you'd like to comment on in terms of the viability of the auto sector?
So it seems that the key thing for the UK in this regard at the moment is really, how do we make it work at home so that we can be part of the, what's happening in the world. So I hear from businesses that the infrastructure, the operational ability to transform their fleets, for example, is really difficult. So if we want to be in a position where we are able to kind of demonstrate and become a country that has a thriving industry, it's important that we almost start this from home. But also thinking about it from a just transition perspective, you know, it is not, even when the costs come down, the infrastructure for charging. So if you live in a block of flats or you live in a terraced house, that ability to be able to use the technology is limited. And I also wanted to make a brief comment on the transition from a health point of view, because I think we mustn't forget all of the issues around air quality and how this transition is really important for health. So I was in Bradford yesterday, and you know, they've had a clean air zone, and they've got really clear evidence from a big longitudinal health study of how making the reducing the air pollution from vehicles is having a tangible effect on people's health and saving the NHS and other sectors of society money. So I think for me, this is not just a trade issue, this is a domestic issue for people and businesses to make the UK's infrastructure resilient and low carbon for the future.
Thanks very much. I think that's an important point to add, and particularly from the fleet purchasing perspective, which is kind of critical in the auto sector. Johnny, anything you'd want to add before we move on? I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, no, just similar remarks, I think. Firstly, just to address the really negative impacts of the Prime Minister's recent backsliding on the phase-out date for new petrol and diesel vehicles. Like, the strength of pushback from the automotive sector itself shows what a blow this is to investor confidence, when the UK could otherwise be more forward-leaning in the transition to electric vehicles and capture first-mover advantages. The UK needs to be attracting investment in gigafactories, like we've heard, and rolling out charging infrastructure in a clear regulatory environment is fundamental for this, as is an industrial strategy and indeed other right trading conditions. And I think, just to kind of go on to your last point about the rules of origin issue, it's looking like the UK might be able to secure a temporary reprieve in the introduction of the stricter EU rules of origin requirements, which would be welcome. But ultimately, we know we need a long-term solution to this issue. Otherwise, we're just going to encounter this cliff edge moment again in a year's time.
Do you think, sorry to interrupt, but do you think the sort of extension, that the reprieve we might get, the length of it, or the extension of any grace period, is going to be sufficient for us to address some of the issues that Ihsan referenced, particularly in relation to battery production?
Yeah, not at all, because it's fundamentally, a lot of it is required on the UK producing batteries at home. And given that we're definitely nowhere near at scale of doing that, we're nowhere near closer to meeting those requirements. And we know that in the context of Chinese competition in this space, you know, China's rolling out EVs and batteries at scale, and that kind of backdrop in the kind of geoeconomic space is even further competition for the UK in this space. And ultimately, that's the reason why the EU has these rules of origin requirements and criteria, is partly from a kind of China de-risking standpoint. So yeah, I think, you know, that the backdrop is gloomy for the UK, even if it's only an extension of a year, the UK being in any better place to meet those requirements in time. So I think what we need really in this space is to have a more kind of full approach in, as we've seen time and again, basically in the overall UK-EU relationship. It's investment in the overall UK-EU relationship that enables tangible progress on individual issues. And I think there's a lot, I think we'll come on some of this later on today, but there's a lot that can be done in the overall UK-EU relationship on climate and energy, which could be elevated.
I have to probably draw a line. We probably will come on to
That's fine. That's fine.
I'll hand back to the chair, but thanks, Johnny.
Paul, thank you very much. Philippa, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'm going to change on to one of the other big environmental issues, which is, of course, waste production, waste management. Obviously, the UK government has blocked the Scottish deposit return scheme and said they must align with the UK scheme due at the end of 2025. Of course, the Prime Minister's recent statements throw into doubt whether that'll happen. So with the UK being second largest producer of plastic waste and exporting over 60% of it, and yet on the other hand, companies like Coca-Cola say they can't get enough recycled plastic to make all of their bottles. Can I ask Johnny and then Gudrun on this one? Could a more circular economy and serious recycling help tackle the problem of exporting our waste? And equally, how do trade rules and trade patterns support or undermine a circular economy? So yourself first, Johnny.
Yeah, sure. So to take that last part first, I had to speak to some trade lawyers to get you an answer to this. But in general, the short answer is that multilateral trade law, the multilateral trading system is neither impeding nor enabling the transition to a circular economy. There are some ways in which the multilateral trading system is presenting difficulties. For instance, we don't have adequate means in terms of distinguishing between recycled and non-recycled goods in terms of tariff codes. So those sorts of things could be addressed and investigated to kind of help in future. But in general, just to kind of endorse your point that a circular economy approach will undoubtedly limit the amount of waste plastic that would need to be exported. And so, yeah, just to massively endorse sustainable alternatives, reusing, recycling being part of this this solution to addressing the exporting of plastic waste. Yeah.
So actually having even just different codes so that we know what is recycled plastic and what isn't would put us, as we heard earlier, it's hard to prove something if you're not measuring it in the first place. So that would put us in a better place. But also, what about trade patterns and the trade deals that we're doing? Are, you know, obviously particularly the further flung ones, the ones that we're hearing about, obviously the CPTPP, but also Gulf, etc., which are very fossil fuel orientated. Are we actually likely to end up with weakening our position regarding waste, or do you see trade patterns and trade deals helping improve that, or actually are we just ignoring that altogether?
Currently mainly ignoring. I think what's interestingly happening increasingly globally is that developing countries are having enough of importing our waste. We're seeing more and more countries bringing in import like restrictions, basically. And so to an extent, actually, our hand is going to start being forced in some of this space, particularly if developing countries don't have the infrastructure to take on a lot of this waste and recycle and manage it. So I think to some extent it's important to have a forward-leaning circular economy strategy at home, because there's a very real chance that some of our traditional importers of the waste will start no longer accepting it.
Okay, thank you. And Gudrun?
Thank you. I would agree with that. I think the market does not incentivize the use of non-virgin materials in any real form at the moment. So there's no strong encouragement to do that. And I would also say that we should be looking at reducing the amount of plastics we produce. Single-use plastics, a lot of it is difficult to recycle anyway. And you know, we've seemed to have got fixated on the recycle level of the waste hierarchy rather than the reduce and reuse. And I think to incentivize and make it easy for manufacturers and retailers and individuals to refill and reuse things is the way that we need to be going, and being able to solve that would be a real opportunity for the UK in terms of then selling that technology to other places in the world that we've all got the same problems. And you know, I met a really great lady in Bradford where I was the last couple of days, who's been working with small food companies to with Borrow. They call it Borrow, and it's cups and boxes that you basically borrow and you bring it back and reuse it. So I think we just need to be careful that we're asking the right questions and making sure that we are intervening in the system in the right places. But a circular economy is absolutely critical for where we're going to go for resource issues. You know, there are a lot of resources that are becoming challenged. And I think, you know, we've got net zero targets, but we also need to start thinking much more carefully about how we use what we, you know, if we're making plastics out of virgin fossil fuel oil for single-use plastics, is that the best use of that material, you know, that resource? And how do we start to look at the biomimicry and doing things in a different way that we are able to use what is a real strength of the UK is that innovation to develop these new solutions that help to tackle the problems at the top of the system, not at the end of the pipe.
Obviously, consumers themselves are driving some of this in that they want to reuse, they want to not have such a throwaway mentality. But do you think that the change in the Prime Minister's stance and the government's stance in general, obviously we heard about the, you know, not enforcing 7 bins on people, etc., and no new recycling. You know, here in Scotland as a Scottish MP, I felt regardless of whatever difficulties we might have had, there would have been learning from our experience that would have made the UK scheme in 2025 perhaps easier. What went well, what didn't, whereas now we're actually just stuck. So do we have anything that is likely to take us forward other than consumer demand and its pressure on businesses to show that they get it, that that's what their customers want?
I think we have business itself, I think, in many ways wanting to make the change. You know, there's so much pressure coming from investors now around climate, around nature, around these issues. There's litigation coming from all sorts of places to look at what businesses are doing, and also tackling, you know, taking countries to task over what they're doing. So I see that the issue comes from all sides. And, you know, we have done several pieces of research with YouGov, and they have shown that people, they really want to do stuff, but they need business and government to make it easy and understandable and affordable. So, you know, we've got to, at the heart of all of this is leadership, and who's going to take that leadership? Is it government? Is it business? Is it civil society? And it needs everybody coming together. And I think one of the things that I would just comment on about the DRS in particular is that in other countries where it's worked really well, they don't have a good curbside recycling scheme. And in the UK, we do have a good curbside recycling scheme. And one of the challenges potentially is that if we do DRS, it takes away some of the high value stuff that is currently collected at the curbside that makes that work. So we have to, with all of these things, there's the what you balance with what, but, you know, we need to think about what we can do and be really positive and proactive about that, and make sure we're intervening at the right level of the system. But I would say from our research and our experience with businesses, both want to create less waste, they want to reuse, and they want to make things and use things differently. That policy framework and that policy certainty is absolutely critical to make all of that happen.
Okay, thank you very much. Back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Philippa. I think the question about infrastructure across the devolved nations is part of the dialogue somewhere on this one, to say the least. Thank you very much for that. Charles, please.
Thanks. What are the benefits to businesses of the UK taking a proactive approach to achieving net zero? And what sort of support do businesses need to decarbonise? And what opportunities do the current and future UK trade relationships present for net zero collaboration, access to green technologies? I'll throw in just at the end of this a personal experience, which is that, as most of you know, I'm a renewable energy generator, and that, we've had to turn down deals with various companies wanting to generate their own electricity from solar on their roofs simply because the infrastructure doesn't exist to enable this to happen. And it seems to me that, some of the energy that's been available from businesses is thwarted by the lack of coordination on the infrastructure level. Can I take that to, can I put that to Esin first, please?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great question. Just starting with taking a step back, the UK has a legal commitment to deliver net zero emissions unless we see a change in law. And so it can either choose to do this in a slow way, it can delay action as much as possible and very likely face a much higher bill further down the line because it would have failed to bring technology costs down earlier on. It would elongate its dependence on oil and gas, and it would make itself vulnerable to increase in damages from climate change. Alternatively, the UK can choose to deliver net zero in a proactive way, as set in this question, and that would mean front-loading investment, crowding in investment to build supply chains here in the UK of the technologies of the future, and that would be the way to unlock export opportunities, regional benefits, and jobs along the way that the UK delivers net zero. And that can include various specific policy instruments depending on different sectoral circumstances. That can be tax incentives, there can be R&D grants, risk sharing frameworks, public infrastructure investments, as you've suggested. Grid expansion and planning reform will be crucial to unlock some of these developments. And then also a really proactive focus on skills. But even with all these different policy instruments, perhaps more importantly, all of these need to be woven into an overall industrial strategy that can outlive political cycles. And that would be what maximizes certainty for businesses, which are having to make these long-term investment decisions to be able to exist in a net zero world in the UK. And if we just to recognize the UK's historically on and off relationship with industrial strategy, it might be helpful to recognize that it's not really a choice anyway. Because if the government doesn't put on paper this explicit industrial strategy, then it just ends up with a backwards industrial policy, which becomes about rescuing incumbent industries. But instead, if the government chooses to make industrial strategy explicit and forward-looking, then it will maximize its chances to capture opportunities from net zero, which many are now calling the growth story of the 21st century. And
Okay, thanks,
yeah.
Thanks, Esin. I'm a little short of time, and I'd quite like to just move this on to Johnny and then back to Gudrun.
Thanks. Yeah, but happy to pick up where Esin left off, because I think, yeah, I definitely agree with everything she said. And I think, we've seen with the example of offshore wind in the UK, other than the recent failed auction, but that says something about the current government's priorities as well. With that story, we've seen how the UK has been able to seize economic opportunities and energy security benefits by being an early mover in the transition, and basically because of having sustained investment and also having policy certainty. In this new world of industrial policy, we've seen the US Inflation Reduction Act, the EU's response, Chinese competition. The UK's competitive asset in this space was its stable policy environment, basically underpinned by cross-party political support for the transition. And frankly, recent moves by the Prime Minister have sabotaged this at a time where international investors are still sceptical about investment following his predecessor's mini budget. So when it comes to trade and net zero, I think there's a lot of kind of damage that needs to be kind of rectified. The thing I point to in response to your question is actually elevating more, as I said before, the overall UK-EU climate and energy relationship. There's so much unimplemented stuff in the UK-EU TCA that needs implementing. We've spoken before about North Sea Energy Corporation, electricity trading, ETS linking, carbon border adjustments, this rules of origin issue. All of this, I think, could be elevated to a higher political level as a package, because it's in the UK's interest to cooperate in this space. And we're starting to see bits of this business support all of this, I hear this regularly in the UK-EU domestic advisory group under the trade deal. We just need a greater political attention and emphasis to implement these priorities.
Thanks very much. And Gudrun, do you have anything to add to this quickly?
I will quickly just add on the support businesses need to decarbonise, because I think that's really important. So as a stable policy environment, incentivising the right things and disincentivising the wrong things, I think is really important. Skills, ensuring that the skills landscape is right, thinking about things like the apprenticeship levy and other mechanisms that could be mobilised around green skills. Working with at the different levels of national, local, devolved government around key issues like planning and to enable the infrastructure are some of the key things.
Thanks very much. This is another story about vision, leadership, and implementation, and it echoes through all of these questions. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Jeff.
Thank you very much, Charles. I think your summary is absolutely right as well. Just to pick this up to finish, if I may ask our three witnesses today, could we just conclude the session by asking each of you for a couple of clear policy recommendations to the UK government regarding trade and net zero? I know we've talked on the need for policy certainty and long-term thinking, but could we look for a couple of clear policy recommendations to go forward, please? Starting with Gudrun, please.
So my first one is that very point about certainty. We would really encourage the UK government to understand its Scope 3 emissions, its consumption-based emissions, and start to embed those. It's hard, it's the hardest thing that businesses are working on, but we can't pretend these things don't exist. And then to work with businesses to collaborate on the actions needed to ensure that the national and international actions on net zero work for the UK and for global organisations, but fundamentally to see net zero and climate action as an opportunity rather than a cost and a threat, and balancing the cost and the threat of inaction against the cost of action, because we always seem to forget that in what we're doing. But a just transition, taking into account people and nature, as well as just carbon, is absolutely essential.
Thank you, Gudrun. Hesson.
Yeah, I think going against the brief a bit, I will also make a high-level recommendation on certainty, and something I've said multiple times by now, just putting forward a clear industrial strategy which would enable the UK to capture growth from international trade in a net zero world. That would be the main thing I can add. And then secondly, the government should think really proactively about how benefits of international trade can contribute to a wider set of domestic economic objectives, and in particular addressing regional disparities. Some inspiration from the Inflation Reduction Act could be taken on that, just tie in provisions to support for local communities and the development of skills locally. And then thirdly, I'd say the UK really needs to work to reinstate its position as a global leader on climate action and use that position to get other countries on board under this ambition to fully align international trade with net zero, because recently we've seen the UK losing credibility in the international arena about how ambitious and serious it is on climate action, and it will need to work really hard to restore that position, crucially at the upcoming COP, but also at international dialogues throughout the year. And only then it would be in a position to demand more ambitious action from others on trade and on climate more generally.
Thank you very much. The thought of having measurements and a plan. Indeed. Johnny.
Yeah, just really quickly, I'll summarize some of the stuff we talked about before in terms of multilateral, bilateral, and unilateral priorities in this space. Multilaterally, I'd say focus on the coalition of trade ministers on climate. We've already discussed some of that stuff already. Don't need to go into that again. Bilateral, I mentioned before, the priority should really be the UK-EU climate and energy relationship. So really just emphasize those points again. And then lastly, on unilateral measures, I do think it's important that the UK introduces a carbon border adjustment mechanism, circling back on your conversation before, thinking about the UK-EU relationship, ETS linking in that context, but also in particular coming up with a really credible offer for international climate finance for developing countries in this space. So recycling some of that CBAM revenue for international climate finance to help developing countries innovate, decarbonise and meet the new UK CBAM standards.
Thank you. That was a good summary to finish. From my perspective, it was a pragmatic and practical session. I really appreciate the evidence given today by the three witnesses. Thank you very much for joining us. I think the opportunity for net zero and for the UK is very much part of the future thinking going forward. I appreciate my fellow commissioners for their questions, and we are, of course, spot on time as I would always expect. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.